Hey everyone, welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads, continuing our story. I guess this is technically part 2 of chapter 1. This will be called The Traumatic Neurosis of War, in the book Trauma and Recovery. Okay, so we're going to get right into it. It looks like this little section should be a little less long. Yeah, this will be a little bit... We could probably actually even finish the chapter, which would be great. So, anyway, without further ado, the traumatic neurosis of war. Okay. The reality of psychological trauma was forced upon the public consciousness once again by the catastrophe of the First World War. In this prolonged war of attrition, over 8 million men died in 4 years. When the slaughter was over, 4 European empires had been destroyed, and many of the cherished beliefs that had sustained Western civilization had been shattered. One of the many casualties of the war's devastation was the illusion of the manly honor and glory in battle. Under conditions of unremitting exposure to the horrors of trench warfare, men began to break down in shocking numbers. Confined and rendered helpless, subjected to constant threat of annihilation, and forced to witness the mutilation and death of their comrades without any hope of reprieve, many soldiers began to act like hysterical women. They screamed and wept uncontrollably. They froze and could not move. They became mute and unresponsive. They lost their memory and their capacity to feel. The number of psychiatric casualties was so great that the hospital had to be hastily requisitioned to house them. According to one estimate, mental breakdowns represented 40% of British battle casualties. Military authorities attempted to suppress reports of psychiatric casualties because of their demoralizing effect on the public. Initially, the symptoms of mental breakdown were attributed to a physical cause. The British psychologist Charles Myers, who examined some of their first cases, attributed their symptoms to the concussive effects of exploding shells and called the resulting nervous disorder shell shock. The name stuck, even though it soon became clear that the syndrome could be found in soldiers who had not been exposed to any physical trauma. Gradually, military psychiatrists were forced to acknowledge that the symptoms of shell shock were due to psychological trauma. The emotional stress of prolonged exposure to violent death was sufficient to produce a neurotic syndrome resembling hysteria in men. When the existence of a combat neurosis could no longer be denied, medical controversy, as in the earlier debate on hysteria, centered upon the moral character of the patient. In the view of traditionalists, a normal soldier should glory in war and betray no signs of emotion. Certainly, he should not succumb to terror. The soldier who developed a traumatic neurosis was at best a constitutionally inferior human being, at worst a malingerer and a coward. Medical writers of the period described these patients as moral invalids. Some military authorities maintained that these men did not deserve to be patients at all, that they should be court-martialed or dishonorably discharged rather than given medical treatment. The most prominent proponent of the traditionalist view was the British psychiatrist Louis Yayland. In his 1918 treatise, Hysterical Disorders of Warfare, he advocated a treatment strategy based on shaming, threats, and punishment. Hysterical symptoms such as mutism, sensory loss, or motor paralysis were treated with electric shocks. Patients were excoriated for their laziness and cowardice. Those who exhibited the hideous enemies of negativism were threatened with court-martial. In one case, Yayland reported treating a mute patient by strapping him into a chair and applying electric shocks to his throat. The treatment went on without respite for hours until the patient finally spoke. As the shocks were applied, Yayland exhorted the patient to remember, "You must behave as the hero I expect you to be. A man who has gone through so many battles should have better control of himself." Progressive medical authorities argued, on the contrary, that combat neurosis was a bona fide psychiatric condition that could occur in soldiers of high moral character. They advocated humane treatment based on psychoanalytic principles. The champion of this more liberal point of view was W.H.R. Rivers, a physician of wide-ranging intellect who was a professor of neuropsychology, psychology, and anthropology. His most famous patient was a young officer, Sigrid Sassoon, who had distinguished himself for conspicuous bravery in combat and for his war poetry. Sassoon gained notoriety when still in uniform, he publicly affiliated himself with the pacifist movement and denounced the war. The text of his Soldier's Declaration, written in 1917, reads like a contemporary anti-war manifesto. I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops and can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. Fearing that Sassoon would be court-martialed, one of his fellow officers, the poet Robert Graves, arranged for him to be hospitalized under Rivers' care. His anti-war statement could then be attributed to a psychological collapse. Though Sassoon had not had a complete emotional breakdown, he did have what Graves described as a bad state of nerves. He was restless, irritable, and tormented by nightmares. His impulsive risk-taking and reckless exposure to danger had earned him the nickname Mad Jack. Today, these symptoms would undoubtedly have qualified him for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Rivers' treatment of Sassoon was intended to demonstrate the superiority of humane, enlightened treatment over the more punitive traditionalist approach. The goal of treatment, as in all military medicine, was to return the patient to combat. Rivers did not question this goal. He did, however, argue for the efficacy of a form of talking cure. Rather than being shamed, Sassoon was treated with dignity and respect. Rather than being silenced, he was encouraged to write and talk freely about the terrors of war. Sassoon responded with gratitude. He made me feel safe at once, and seemed to know all about me. I would give a lot for a few gramophone records of my talks with Rivers. All that matters is my remembrance of the great and good man who gave me his friendship and guidance. Rivers' psychotherapy of his famous patient was judged a success. Sassoon publicly disavowed his pacifist statement and returned to combat. He did so even though his political convictions were unchanged. What induced him to return was the loyalty he felt to his comrades, who were still fighting, his guilt at being spared their suffering, and his despair at the ineffectiveness of his isolated protest. Rivers, by pursuing a course of humane treatment, had established two principles that would be embraced by American military psychiatrists in the next war. He had demonstrated first that men of unquestioned bravery could succumb to overwhelming fear, and second, that the most effective motivation to overcome that fear was something stronger than patriotism, abstract principles, or hatred of the enemy. It was the love of soldiers for one another. Sassoon survived the war, but like many survivors with combat neurosis, he was condemned to relive it for the rest of his life. He devoted himself to writing and rewriting his war memoirs, to preserving the memory of the fallen, and to furthering the cause of pacifism. Though he recovered from his bad case of nerves sufficiently to have a productive life, he was haunted by the memory of those who had not been so fortunate. Shell shock. How many a brief bombardment had its long delayed after effect in the minds of these survivors, many of whom had looked at their companions and laughed while Inferno did its best to destroy them. Not then was their evil hour, but now. Now in the sweating suffocation of nightmare, and paralysis of limbs, in the stammering of dislocated speech. Worst of all, in the disintegration of those qualities through which they had been so gallant and selfless and uncomplaining. This, in the finer types of men, was the unspeakable tragedy of shell shock. In the name of civilization, these soldiers had been martyred, and it remained for civilization to prove that their martyrdom wasn't a dirty swindle. Within a few years after the end of the war, medical interest in the subject of psychological trauma faded once again. Though numerous men with long-lasting psychiatric disabilities crowded the back wards of veterans' hospitals, their presence had become an embarrassment to civilian societies eager to forget. In 1922, a young American psychiatrist, Abram Kardner, returned to New York from a year-long pilgrimage to Vienna where he had been analyzed by Freud. He was inspired by the dream of making a great discovery. What could be more adventurous, he thought, than to be a Columbus in the relatively new science of the mind? Kardner set up a private practice of psychoanalysis at a time where there were perhaps 10 psychoanalysts in New York. He also went to work in the psychiatric clinic of the Veterans Bureau, where he saw numerous men with combat neurosis. He was troubled by the severity of their distress and by his inability to cure them. In particular, he remembered one patient whom he treated for a year without notable success. Later, when the patient thanked him, Kardner protested, "But I never did anything for you. I certainly didn't cure your symptoms." "But Doc," the patient replied, "you did try. I've been around the Veterans Administration for a long time, and I know they don't even try, and they don't really care. But you did." Kardner subsequently acknowledged that the ceaseless nightmare of his own early childhood, poverty, hunger, neglect, domestic violence, and his mother's untimely death had influenced the direction of his intellectual pursuits and allowed him to identify with the traumatized soldiers. Kardner struggled for a long time to develop a theory of war trauma within the intellectual framework of psychoanalysis. But he eventually abandoned the task as impossible and went on to a distinguished career first in psychoanalysis and then, like his predecessor Rivers, in anthropology. In 1939, in collaboration with the anthropologist Cora Dubois, he authored a basic anthropology text, The Individual and His Society. It was only then, after writing this book, that he was able to return to the subject of war trauma, this time having in anthropology a conceptual framework that recognized the impact of social reality and enabled him to understand psychological trauma. In 1941, Kardner published a comprehensive clinical and theoretical study, The Traumatic Neurosis of War, in which he complained of the episodic amnesia that had repeatedly disrupted the field. The subject of neurotic disturbances consequent upon war has, in the past 25 years, been submitted to a good deal of capriciousness in public interest and psychiatric whims. The public does not sustain its interest, which was very great after World War I, and neither does psychiatry. Hence, these conditions are not subject to continuous study, but only to periodic efforts which cannot be characterized as very diligent. In part, this is due to the declining status of the veteran after a war. Though not true in psychiatry generally, it is a deplorable fact that each investigator who undertakes to study these conditions considers it his sacred obligation to start from scratch and work at the problem as if no one had ever done anything with it before. Kardner went on to develop the clinical outlines of the traumatic syndrome as it is understood today. His theoretical formulation strongly resembled Janet's late 19th century formulations of hysteria. Genet. Indeed, Kardner recognized that war neurosis represented a form of hysteria, but he also realized that the term had once again become so pejorative that its very use discredited patients. When the word hysterical is used, its social meaning is that the subject is a predatory individual, trying to get something for nothing. The victim of such a neurosis is, therefore, without sympathy in court, and without sympathy from his physicians, who often take hysterical to mean that the individual is suffering from some persistent form of wickedness, perversity, or weakness of will. With the advent of the Second War came a revival of medical interest in combat neurosis. In the hopes of finding a rapid, efficacious treatment, military psychiatrists tried to remove the stigma from the stress reactions of combat. It was recognized for the first time that any man could break down under fire and that psychiatric casualties could be predicted in direct proportion to the severity of combat exposure. Indeed, considerable effort was devoted to determining the exact level of exposure guaranteed to produce a psychological collapse. A year after the war ended, two American psychiatrists, J.W. Apple and G.W. Beebe, concluded that 200 to 240 days in combat would suffice to break even the strongest soldier. There's no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Thus, psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare. American psychiatrists focus their energy on identifying those factors that might protect against acute breakdown or lead to rapid recovery. They discovered once again that Rivers had demonstrated in his treatment of Sassoon the power of emotional attachments among fighting men. In 1947, Kardner revised his classic text in collaboration with Herbert Spiegel, a psychiatrist who had just returned from treating men at the front. Kardner and Spiegel argued that the strongest protection against overwhelming terror was the degree of relatedness between the soldier, his immediate fighting unit, and their leader. Similar findings were reported by the psychiatrists Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, who noted that the situation of constant danger led soldiers to develop extreme emotional dependency upon their peer group and leaders. They observed that the strongest protection against psychological breakdown was the morale and leadership of the small fighting unit. The treatment strategies that evolved during the Second World War were designed to minimize the separation between the afflicted soldier and his comrades. Opinion favored a brief intervention as close as possible to the battle lines, with the goal of rapidly returning the soldier to his fighting unit. In their quest for a quick and effective method of treatment, military psychiatrists once again discovered the mediating role of altered states of consciousness in psychological trauma. They found that artificially induced altered states could be used to gain access to traumatic memories. Kardner and Spiegel used hypnosis to induce an altered state, while Grinker and Spiegel used sodium emetol to a technique they called narcosynthesis. As in the early work on Hysteria, the focus of the talking cure for combat neurosis was on the recovery and cathartic reliving of the traumatic memories, with all their attendant emotions of terror, rage, and grief. The psychiatrists who pioneered these techniques understood that unburdening traumatic memories was not in itself sufficient to effect a lasting cure. Kardner and Spiegel warned that although hypnosis could expedite the retrieval of traumatic memories, a simple cathartic experience by itself was useless. Hypnosis failed, they explained, where there is not sufficient follow-through. Grinker and Spiegel observed likewise that treatment would not succeed if the memories retrieved and discharged under the influence of sodium amytal were not integrated into consciousness. The effect of combat, they argued, is not like the writing on a slate that can be erased, leaving the slate as it was before. Combat leaves a lasting impression on men's minds, changing them as radically as any crucial experience through which they live. These wise warnings, however, were generally ignored. The new rapid treatment for psychiatric casualties was considered highly successful at the time. According to one report, 80% of the American fighting men who succumbed to acute stress in the Second World War were returned to some kind of duty, usually within a week. 30% were returned to combat units. Little attention was paid to the fate of these men once they returned to active duty, let alone after they returned home from the war. As long as they could function on a minimal level, they were thought to have recovered. With the end of the war, the familiar process of amnesia set in once again. There was little medical or public interest in the psychological condition of returning soldiers. The lasting effects of war trauma were once again forgotten. Systematic, large-scale investigation of the long-term psychological effects of combat was not undertaken until after the Vietnam War. This time, the motivation for study came not from the military or the medical establishment, but from the organized efforts of the soldiers disaffected from war. In 1970, while the Vietnam War was at its height, two psychiatrists, Robert J. Lifton and Khayyam Shatan, met with the representatives of a new organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. For veterans to organize against their own war while it was still ongoing was virtually unprecedented. This small group of soldiers, many of whom had distinguished themselves for bravery, returned their medals and offered public testimony of their war crimes. Their presence contributed moral credibility to a growing anti-war movement. They raised questions, Lifton wrote, about everyone's version of the socialized war and the war system, and exposed their country's counterfeit claim of a just war. The anti-war veterans organized what they called rap groups. In these intimate meetings of their peers, Vietnam veterans retold and relived the traumatic experiences of war. They invited sympathetic psychiatrists to offer them professional assistance. Shatan later explained, why the men sought help outside of a traditional psychiatric setting. A lot of them were hurting, as they put it, but they didn't want to go to the Veterans Administration for help. They needed something that would take place on their own turf, where they were in charge. The purpose of the rap groups was twofold: to give solace to individual veterans who had suffered psychological trauma, and to raise awareness about the effects of war. The testimony that came out of these groups focused public attention on the lasting psychological injuries of combat. These veterans refused to be forgotten. Moreover, they refused to be stigmatized. They insisted upon the rightness or the dignity of their distress. In the words of a Marine veteran, Michael Norman, family and friends wondered why we were so angry. "What are you crying about?" they would ask. "Why are you so ill-tempered and disaffected? Our fathers and grandfathers had gone off to war, done their duty, come home, and got on with it. What made our generation so different?" As it turns out, nothing. No difference at all. When old soldiers from good wars are dragged from behind the curtain of myth and sentiment and brought into the light, they too seem to smolder with choler and alienation. So we were angry. Our anger was old, atavistic. We were angry as all civilized men who have ever been sent to make murder in the name of virtue were angry. By the mid-1970s, hundreds of informal rap groups had been organized. By the end of the decade, the political pressure from the veterans organizations resulted in a legal mandate for a psychological treatment program called Operation Outreach within the Veterans Administration. Over 100 outreach centers were organized, staffed by veterans, and based upon a self-help, pure counseling model of care. The insistent organization of veterans also provided for the impetus for systematic psychiatric research. In the years following the Vietnam War, the Veterans Administration commissioned comprehensive studies tracing the impact of wartime experiences on the lives of returning veterans. A 5-volume study on the legacies of Vietnam delineated the syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder and demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt its direct relationship to combat exposure. The moral legitimacy of the anti-war movement and the national experience of defeat in a discredited war had made it possible to recognize psychological trauma as a lasting and inevitable legacy of war. In 1980, for the first time, the characteristic syndrome of psychological trauma became a real diagnosis. In that year, the American Psychiatric Association included in its official manual of mental disorders a new category called post-traumatic stress disorder. The clinical features of this disorder were congruent with the traumatic neurosis that Kardner had outlined 40 years before. Thus, the syndrome of psychological trauma, periodically forgotten and periodically rediscovered through the past century, finally attained formal recognition within the diagnostic canon. Okay, we're gonna do it. The combat neurosis of the sex war. The late 19th century studies of hysteria foundered on the question of sexual trauma. At the time of these investigations, there was no awareness that violence is a routine part of women's sexual and domestic lives. Freud glimpsed this truth and retreated in horror. For most of the 20th century, it was the study of combat veterans that led to development of a body of knowledge about traumatic disorders. Not until the women's liberation movement of the 1970s was it recognized that the most common post-traumatic disorders are not of men in war, but of women in civilian life. The real conditions of women's lives were hidden in the sphere of personal and private life. The cherished value of privacy created a powerful barrier to consciousness and rendered men's reality practically invisible. To speak about experiences in sexual or domestic life was to invite public humiliation, ridicule, and disbelief. Women were silenced by fear and shame, and the silence of women gave license to every form of sexual and domestic exploitation. Women did not have a name for the tyranny of private life. It was difficult to recognize that a well-established democracy in the public sphere could coexist with conditions of primitive autocracy or advanced dictatorship in the home. Thus, it was no accident that in the first manifesto of the resurgent American feminist movement, Betty Friedan called the woman question the problem without a name. It was also no accident that the initial method of the movement was called consciousness raising. Consciousness raising took place in groups that shared many characteristics of the veterans' rap groups and of psychotherapy. They had the same intimacy, the same confidentiality, and the same imperative of truth-telling. The creation of a privileged space made it possible for women to overcome the barriers of denial, secrecy, and shame that prevented them from naming their injuries. In the protected environment of the consulting room, women had dared to speak of rape, but the learned men of science had not believed them. In the protected environment of the consciousness-raising groups, women spoke of rape and other women believed them. A poem of this era captures the exhilaration that women felt in speaking aloud and being heard. Today, in my small natural body, I sit and learn. My woman's body, like yours, target on any street, taken from me at the age of 12. I watch a woman dare. I dare to watch a woman. We dare to raise our voices. Though the methods of consciousness raising were analogous to those of psychotherapy, their purpose was to effect social rather than individual change. A feminist understanding of the sexual assault empowered victims to breach the barriers of privacy, to support one another, and to take collective action. Consciousness raising was also an empirical method of inquiry. Kathy Sarachild, one of the originators of the consciousness raising, described it as a challenge to the prevailing intellectual orthodoxy. The decision to empathize our own feelings and experiences as women, to test all generalizations, and reading we did by our own experience was actually the scientific method of research. We were in effect repeating the 17th century challenge of science to scholasticism: study nature, not books, and put all theories to the test of living practice and action. The process that began with consciousness raising led by stages to increased levels of public awareness. The first public speak out on rape was organized by the New York radical feminists in 1971. The first international tribunal on crimes against women was held in Brussels in 1976. Rape reform legislation was initiated in the United States by the National Organization for Women in the mid-1970s. Within a decade, reforms had been enacted in all 50 states in order to encourage the silenced victims of sexual crimes to come forward. Beginning in the 1970s, the American women's movement also generated an explosion of research on the previously ignored subject of sexual assault. In 1975, in response to feminist pressure, a Center for Research on Rape was created within the National Institute of Mental Health. For the first time, the doors were opened to women as the agents rather than the objects of inquiry. In contrast to the usual research norms, most of the principal investigators funded by the center were women. Feminist investigators labored close to their subjects. They repudiated emotional detachment as a measure of the value of scientific investigation and frankly honored their emotional connection with their informants. As in the heroic age of hysteria, long and intimate personal interviews became once again a source of knowledge. The results of these investigations confirmed the reality of women's experiences that Freud had dismissed as fantasies a century before. Sexual assaults against women and children were shown to be pervasive and endemic in our culture. The most sophisticated epidemiological survey was conducted in the early 1980s by Diana Russell, a sociologist and human rights activist. Over 900 women, chosen by random sampling techniques, were interviewed in depth about their experiences of domestic violence and sexual exploitation. The results were horrifying. 1 woman in 4 had been raped. 1 woman in 3 had been sexually abused in childhood. In addition to documenting pervasive sexual violence, the feminist movement offered a new language for understanding the impact of sexual assault. Entering the public discussion of rape for the first time, women found it necessary to establish the obvious, that rape is an atrocity. Feminists redefined rape as a crime of violence rather than a sexual act. This simplistic formulation was advanced to counter the view that rape fulfilled women's deepest desires, a view then prevailing in every form of literature, from popular pornography to academic texts. Feminists also redefined rape as a method of political control, enforcing the subordination of women through terror. The author Susan Brown Miller, whose landmark treatise on rape established the subject as a matter for public debate, called attention to rape as a means of maintaining male power. Man's discovery that his genitalia could serve as a weapon to generate fear must rank as one of the most important discoveries of prehistoric times, along with the use of fire and the first crude stone axe. From prehistoric times to the present, I believe rape has played a critical function. It is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. The women's movement not only raised public awareness of rape, but also initiated a new social response to victims. The first Rape Crisis Center opened its doors in 1971. A decade later, hundreds of such centers had sprung up throughout the United States. Organized outside the framework of medicine or the mental health system, these grassroots agencies offered practical, legal, and emotional support to rape victims. Rape crisis centers volunteers often accompanied victims to the hospital, to the police station, and to the courthouse in order to advocate for the dignified and respectful care that was so conspicuously lacking. Though their efforts were often met with hostility and resistance, they were also at times a source of inspiration for professional women working within these institutions. In 1972, Anne Burgess, a psychiatric nurse, and Linda Holmstrom, a sociologist, embarked on a study of the psychological effects of rape. They arranged to be on call day or night in order to interview and counsel any rape victim who came to the emergency room of Boston City Hospital. In a year, they saw 92 women and 37 children. They observed a pattern of psychological reactions which they called rape trauma syndrome. They noted that women experienced rape as a life-threatening event, having generally feared mutilation and death during the assault. They remarked that in the aftermath of rape, victims complained of insomnia, nausea, startle responses, and nightmares, as well as dissociative or numbing symptoms. And they commented that some of the victims' symptoms resembled those previously described in combat veterans. Rape was the feminist movement's initial paradigm for violence against women in the sphere of personal life. As understanding deepened, the investigation of sexual exploitation progressed to encompass relationships of increasing complexity, in which violence and intimacy commingled. The initial focus on street rape committed by strangers led step by step to the exploration of acquaintance rape, date rape, and rape in marriage. The initial focus on rape as a form of violence against women led to the exploration of domestic battery and other forms of private coercion. And the initial focus on the rape of adults led to inevitably to a discovery of the sexual abuse of children. As in the case of rape, the initial work on domestic violence and the sexual abuse of children grew out of the feminist movement. Services for victims were organized outside of the traditional mental health system, often with the assistance of professional women inspired by the movement. The pioneering research of the psychological effects of victimization was carried out by women who saw themselves as active and committed participants in the movement. As in the case of rape, the psychological investigations of domestic violence and child sexual abuse led to a rediscovery of the syndrome of psychological trauma. The psychologist Lenore Walker, describing women who had fled to a shelter, initially defined what she called the battered women syndrome. My own initial descriptions of the psychology of incest survivors essentially recapitulated the late 19th century observations of hysteria. Only after 1980, when the efforts of combat veterans had legitimated the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, did it become clear that the psychological syndrome seen in survivors of rape, domestic battery, and incest was essentially the same as the syndrome seen in survivors of war. The implications of this insight are as horrifying in the present as they were a century ago. The subordinate condition of women is maintained and enforced by the hidden violence of men. There is war between the sexes. Rape victims, battered women, and sexually abused children are its casualties. Hysteria is the combat neurosis of the sex war. 50 years ago, Virginia Woolf wrote that the public and private worlds are inseparably connected. The tyrannies and servilities of one are the tyrannies and servilities of the other. It is now apparent also that the traumas of one are the traumas of the other. The hysteria of women and the combat neurosis of men are one. Recognizing the commonality of affliction may even make it possible at times to transcend the immense gulf that separates the public sphere of war and politics, the world of men, and the private sphere of domestic life, the world of women. Will these insights be lost once again? At the moment, the study of psychological trauma seems to be firmly established as a legitimate field of inquiry. With the creative energy that accompanies the return of repressed ideas, this field has expanded dramatically. 20 years ago, the literature consisted of a few out-of-print volumes moldering in the neglected corners of the library. Now each month brings forth the publications of new books, new research findings, new discussions in the public media. But history teaches us that this knowledge could also disappear. Without the context of a political movement, it has never been possible to advance the study of psychological trauma. The fate of this field of knowledge depends on the fate of the same political movement that has inspired and sustained it over the last century. In the late 19th century, the goal of that movement was the establishment of secular democracy. In the early 20th century, its goal was the abolition of war. In the late 20th century, its goal was the liberation of women. All of these goals remain. All are, in the end, inseparably connected. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1. And I will say, some brief things to say about this. One of the things that I'm glad it points out, because this is something that I end up saying to my clients a lot, trauma is trauma, right? And abuse is abuse. It does not really matter in the grand scheme of things how it happened to you. Your trauma and my trauma are the same, right? There was something that happened to both of us that caused that terror, that fear, that guilt, whatever it was, right? We both had a moment or an experience which it caused us to fear for our lives, right? Anything like that, that's a trauma, right? And even smaller than that, is the idea that trauma can be something that simply just shakes up your worldview, right? Changes your identity, or how you see yourself, how you see the world, how you see your environment, right? Anything that does that is something that can very certainly be considered a trauma, right? And it's still a conversation today. It's still a conversation of, if somebody who comes back from being a combat soldier, combat specialist or whatever, whatever kind of variety they may be called, right? Do they have the same, do they deserve or require the same attention as somebody who was abused within their marriage, physically, mentally, emotionally, and vice versa? And the truth is, yeah, 100%. And I think that's one of the major points of this chapter, or the second part of this chapter, is just that, there's often a lot of interest in comparing, right? And even between abuse survivors or abuse, trauma survivors, right? Like, you are complaining about your symptoms about this thing, which to me feels little because comparatively I've done something that was huge to me, right? And we will get more into that as a discussion later on in this book, but really, it's important to note, that trauma, and I think even the point of the first half of the chapter, is something that needs to become believed and respected, whether or not there's an agenda attached to it, right? And that's something that I think this beginning chapter is really trying to drive home, is that, as a society, we tend to fall out of interest in mental health in general, when there's nothing driving it politically, right? And I don't believe that that's a problem of people at large, but possibly just the way that our government runs, right? If there's no benefit, to the people in power for us to be studying this or us to be latching on to this, then there will be whatever amount of distraction they need from it, right? Or at least a lack of funding. When we talk about school shootings and things like that, the outcry for funding in schools has been ongoing for years, and it hasn't been something very timid either. Every time this has happened, since Columbine, it seems as though what gets heard is gun control. What gets heard is better securities or worse security. When the truth is, what's at the base of every part of it is mental health, right? What is at the basis of every single child, man, woman, perpetrator who has picked up a gun and decided to shoot it at somebody to resolve their own pain or make their own point is mental health, right? And so the truth of the matter, and the point, like I said, of this chapter is that there has always been a need for trauma and mental health to be given a greater spotlight in society, always, and what has pushed it forward is the progression of the feminist movement, which we owe credit to, for a lot of this, and various other little political movements as well, right? And so something that I think I'm going to leave you guys with, pretty much mostly as a challenge, is to speak up, to act about it. Today I've got my my combat, my PTSD shirt for combat veterans, right? And I wear this casually too. I don't just wear this when I'm trying to make a point, but, really speak out about it, right? And if you're a teacher, if you're a student, if you're somebody in a place where that mental health is not being respected or funded well, make a loud noise about that. Make a loud noise about that, because that is something that is going to change society, right? There are more of us than there are of anybody that's in power, right? And so the idea is, we want to make sure that this doesn't go away, right? We want to make sure that the study of trauma, the study of mental health in general, is not something that becomes obsolete whenever it no longer serves a purpose politically, right? And again, this will be something that I most definitely will get into later to greater degree, but even the mental health support within the military has a hell of, excuse my language, has quite a ways to go, right? It has I think the general idea is that military mental health is about 15 or so years behind civilian mental health, right? And as it mentioned in this chapter, back in the 70s and World War I, World War II, there was not a whole lot of support mental health wise for the soldiers that were being thrown into these combat situations, both during the combat situation and after leaving the military, right? After coming home from the war, leaving the military, there was nothing for them, right? Even and it's gotten better, but there's still so much to do. There's still so much work that needs to be done in the resources that the military uses, and even the mentality that the military uses. I believe at the moment, there's still if you come back and you got some sort of PTSD, you got about 6 months to kind of get mission ready, as they call it. Get yourself back on your feet and able to, continue on, before they discharge you. And then once they discharge you, you got either the VA, which, is hit or miss. There's some VAs that are really great and some that are just meh, right? And even if you do get into one that's good, I've heard the wait is still relatively long. Like you don't get the regulation or the regular meetings or things that you need. And then your options are to find a civilian therapist who is trained well and skilled, but has no idea, right? what you've been through, because the military experience is a very 1% of the population kind of experience, and so it's just hard to explain to someone who you know don't really know if they know or could even understand, because it is such an atrocious thing to go through. Anyway, before I go on a soapbox, because I'm likely to, the point of this chapter, I think, and this section especially, is that, you know, there seems to be, even, you know, presently, there seems to be this good, powerful movement of making mental health more important and more prominent in society. However, you know, it does seem to be, there's still a need, right? There's still a need for improvement. There's still a need for changes in various places, so that this can become something that we study more about, right? Because it's still, generally speaking, compared to a lot of other disorders, it's still something that, like, people are afraid to go too deep into. Like it was mentioned in the beginning of the chapter, because there's this sudden awareness of something horrible, right? Something that, you know, you don't want to imagine the kind of terror a person can go through. You don't want to imagine, you know, the things that people go through that create this trauma, right? And so studying it creates that awareness of it, and creating awareness of it means I have to now do something about this, right? That's my moral obligation now, is to take care of this. So, I really want to challenge you guys as we're going through these chapters to really, you know, evaluate places where you can improve this, you know, the idea or the concept of, or the endeavor of improving mental health, you know, and not just socially, but within yourself, right? You know, challenge yourself to really look deep and ask yourself, hey, am I causing trauma to anybody? You know, because we will get into more specifics about what makes trauma in a little bit. I think the next chapter will start right into it, but yeah, so I just challenge you to make this something meaningful and not just something you're studying to know, right? Make this something go further than that. With that, I gotta let you guys go. I gotta get going, but you all have a great day. I'll see you guys in the next video.